Alrighty. Hey everyone, Tristan here from FinOut. Welcome. We're about to give it about a minute or two for folks to kind of trickle in. But I was wondering, Zach, Peter, how are you guys doing? Good to see you.
Good seeing you.
Good to
Doing
see you,
well.
Tristan.
Where are you guys both dialing in from today?
I'm in bright and sunny North Carolina. Peter, what about you?
I am in cloudy Orlando, Florida.
Yeah, I'm in rainy New York, so you guys both got a little better than me.
Mixed bag.
Mhm. And just quick check, everyone can hear me. I could hear you guys clearly. Just want to make sure.
Gotcha.
Sounds great to me.
Alrighty. So we'll give it a couple more moments here while people join. Alright. And just before we get started, a quick note. Anyone have any questions during the conversation? Feel free to drop them either the question box or the chat. We'll make time for a Q&A at the end. We're probably about to save 7 to 10 minutes at the end to answer these questions. And also, this session is being recorded, so we'll send out that recording afterward to anyone who's looking forward to sharing it with some of their teammates. Alrighty. Okay. Are you? I guess we'll start now. Or so, just want to thank everyone for joining. Like I mentioned before, I'm Tristan Cruz from FinOut. I'll be moderating today. Today, joining us is Zak Brown and Peter Crenshaw. So, Zach a strategic solutions consultant and FinOps practitioner. He's working with large companies like NVIDIA and Sony, and previously spent about 6 years in FinOps and Apptio at IBM, where he created Cloudability and Total Cost product. Peter is a FinOps and cloud practitioner, infrastructure leader with deep experience driving strategic initiatives for enterprise organizations, including M&A integration and global team management. So we're going to start off and just want to make sure everyone knows we're talking about managing cloud spend through M&A. So how teams are accelerating value, making sure that everything goes smoothly amongst your mergers and acquisitions. So I'll pass it off to you, Zach.
And thank you very much, Tristan. So first question is why are we actually hosting a webinar on M&A, and why are we doing that right now? Well, for 80 to 90% of all Fortune 100s, Fortune 500s, M&A is a huge part of growth, whether that's planned or it just happened. For most startups, M&A is a huge path to exit, and we see it throughout the space and throughout the markets. But in the 2026 State of FinOps survey recently that just came out about a week and a half ago, we didn't really see anyone talking about M&A. So we wanted to make sure that we spent a little bit of time here. We've got a great speaker alongside me here with Peter. And what we're going to be doing is having this really important conversation. This is designed for executives, for advisory firms. This is for FinOps. This is for finance. This is for engineering. In today's market, FinOps is essential and has to be on the front lines during the M&A process. If you are in a FinOps role or team and you're not helping in these areas, your company is missing out on millions of dollars of potential value. So we're going to talk through why FinOps is really a secret weapon for M&A, especially today. And then we're going to go through the lens, the whole M&A process. And we're actually going to spend a little bit of time talking through how FinOps is going to be an additive in each of the phases through this process. Let me start here. So why is FinOps a secret weapon for M&A? And I'm going to start with this first concept up at the top. And this is the idea of a valuation multiplier. So whenever you're looking at just valuing a company in general, there are many different ways to do it. One of the ways involves taking a revenue, maybe an EBITDA or another similar metric, and actually multiplying it by an industry standard multiplier. So what this means is that when maybe private equity firms, for example, buy a company, a lot of times what they do is they'll actually do what's called a deal swap. They might take 100K in software from that company, sell it to another company in their portfolio, and vice versa. Now, the net of this is that the margin doesn't change, but the top line revenue does. So that company becomes uh, significantly more valuable using that multiplier. Well, the same holds true for that reduction of cost. So one of the very first things that companies actually look for when they're going through this process is actually, hey, are there all of these opportunities for maybe it's synergies, maybe it's just cost reduction, because that'll add a multiplier to the value in that deal. The next is this area of cloud infrastructure within cost of goods sold. So for modern companies these days, cloud infrastructure is often 30 to 50% of cost of goods sold. Now, just think about that for a minute. That is absolutely massive. For many companies that aren't even SaaS or software companies, cloud infrastructure might be the single biggest expense, the single biggest line item that they have. And if we think about other historical expenses, so labor, salaries has historically been one of the biggest expenses for companies. Management consulting as a business is hundreds of billions of dollars as an industry. And yet we see that cloud infrastructure consulting is just a fraction of that. This should be more talked about. It should be more important. And it is one of the most important things for M&A. That's why we're talking about it today. Within cloud infrastructure, companies also look for a series of metrics. So it might be something as simple as revenue over hosting cost, might be a similar one. But they look for these kind of standard ranges of a variety of metrics. And entire deals can be disqualified if these metrics fall out of these standard ranges. So when you're maybe a mid to large enterprise and you're the one being acquired, your metrics fall out of this range and suddenly the deal falls through. It's incredibly important that this data is accurate, it is real time, it's up to speed, and you have that FinOps lens when you're dealing with this. Finally, we'll look at this from a risk mitigation lens. So oftentimes when you're looking at actually purchasing a company or you're going through this process to figure out the value that can be generated, you focus on this idea of synergies. The synergies might be, do we have economies of scale? Could we just take our AWS spend, their AWS spend, suddenly get a bigger bulk discount because we're working together, right? It can be a little bit more difficult than you might think. And there are some hidden risks that we'll actually spend some time talking through during this presentation. But these are some of the areas why FinOps right now should be talked about in the M&A space. And it is absolutely shocking that we don't see it as involved as it should be. Now, with this, what we're going to do is actually start talking about the phases of M&A activity and how FinOps is going to be involved in each of those phases to add additional value. So we'll look at this from three lenses. Phase one will be, we call this diligence lens. So this is the pre-acquisition. This is when the buyer, the target, they'll start signing some paperwork. They'll look at the underlying infrastructure. They'll come up with a series of things that they're looking for and make sure that they actually get the pass in that due diligence process. Phase two will be after things are actually signed. This will be maybe the first 100 days of that M&A journey. This is where you start to try to get everything integrated and you come up with a series of challenges and some hidden risks. Phase three is that future state. This is where we might start migrating architecture. We might be combining different lenses, and we're going to try to reconcile a series of cultures that might be completely different. And we're going to talk about FinOps in each of these phases. So phase one, the diligence lens. We're going to focus on two key perspectives here. So first we have the buyer's perspective. And what we're going to be thinking about here, what the buyer tends to look for in the diligence phase, is the infrastructure of this company scalable and is it secure? Are there opportunities for savings? And then do some of those metrics that we talked about, do key KPIs, unit economics fall within acceptable ranges? For the target perspective, we're going to look at, can we report these metrics quickly and accurately? How do we show these potential synergies and get that buyer excited about the potential as we're going to work together? So we're going to go one at a time here. And Peter, I'm going to go to you. Let's start with the first one. But from your perspective, what cloud cost data should buyers review during this due diligence process? And maybe what are they not getting to today that they probably should?
Sure. So typically the request comes across as, what are your COGS? What's your total spend in different areas, right? You mentioned salary and people and systems, but it's a lump sum. It's not broken down into the individual parts. Uh, you may ask for cloud spend and get a total number, but it's usually your annual spend. And as FinOps practitioners, know, there's a lot under the hood of that cloud cost spend, right? There's your actual usage, there's utilization, there's ingress, egress, and then also your commitments or your CUDs, depending on which provider and hyperscaler you're using. So buyers should be reviewing the details of that cloud spend, not just the top number, the total number. So understanding what is under commitment, understanding what is your transport fees, your ingress, egress, and also understanding what your services are that you're paying for are important pieces that aren't necessarily covered. What you don't want to do is, as a buyer, look at a total and say, yeah, well, we're going to move that, they're an AWS shop and we're an Azure shop. We're going to move everything over. And you acquire the company and find out that they've signed a 3-year commitment to AWS that is not portable and you can't change it because you're not an AWS vendor, right? So you just can't cancel those things. So now you're locked in. So now your pricing models and your cost models are all invalid because you only planned on that cost for 1 year. Now you're carrying that cost for 3 years. So the large pieces of the cost are very important to the buyer to understand, not just total spend, but how that spend is broken down.
Yeah, and it sounds like when you start getting a little bit more of this detail as well, you might not make some of the assumptions you would have made before. When you have that additional layer, it sounds like it really might help for better planning of what those future synergies look like.
Right. So if you are in a lock-in period due to commitments and it's a 3-year commitment, let's say, you can stretch out your migration plan for 3 years, gives yourself a little bit more time. We're paying for that anyway. Why rush if we don't need to compress down and move providers and pay those costs for exporting out the data and rebuilding things? It gives you more runway. Or does your board want to just move quickly? They understand that it's now going to be a write-off because you acquired that company. They already have these commitments, and that can be classified differently as part of the transaction from a reporting perspective. So it changes the approach completely based on what that timeline looks like, what the intention is, and can throw off forecasts considerably due to the amount of spend that SaaS is.
Well, even just like whenever I hear that word there, just forecasting in general has historically been so difficult in the
Mhm.
FinOps space. There's so many factors that go into this. There's so much growth that may or may not be planned. That seems infinitely more complicated during the M&A phase when you're trying to reconcile two various different, systems, right?
Absolutely, yeah, it is very complicated, and typically, I've seen, using the last kind of 3-year spend because everybody's, spend is growing. Take the last 3 years, look at how much it grew, how their customers grew, and then kind of use that as your um, metric going forward to forecast out future years. So it is very hard. It becomes more complicated when you don't understand the unit economics. You don't understand necessarily the market fully, or maybe you understand the market, but that product in the market, and then what the buyer's intention is, right? Is it a competitor buy where you're just trying to reduce competition and acquire those customers through acquisition that way, or is it a product buy? So you're going to sunset that product and move that functionality into your product. There's different reasons for doing the acquisition that change those forecasts as well. So it is very, very complicated to do. All the information you really have is the last couple of years of spend and growth, and then you forecast that out, saying if it stays as is, here's what it would be, and go from there.
Yeah. And I think we see where just using those last couple years at a top level for something like forecasting, especially in something like a regression model, could be really just high variance over what you can actually expect. So
Yes,
definitely bring in your FinOps teams for more of that context.
absolutely,
So
yes.
the next question here, and I've got a couple follow-up questions that I
Mhm.
want to make sure we get through here, but from your perspective, what metrics matter the most to buyers? And kind of a sub point of that will be why can some of those be a little bit misleading?
Yeah, so metric wise, in addition to having that breakdown, right, you want to see their unit economics, whatever their unit of record is. Is it the number of entries? Is it the number of customers? Is it per unit? Whatever that might be. What is their unit economics, and how have those evolved? So what were your unit economics a year ago, if possible, and your unit economics now, um, along with your support tickets, and how often have you had emergency changes to fix things, because that can throw a model off very quickly. If you release something with one forecast and suddenly it doesn't meet expectations, and you're adding hardware, you're adding systems, you're adding platforms to support it, you want to know how many changes were made in the course of this that impacted costs,
Mhm.
and everything that goes into that solution to see the full picture. You may not have all those answers. A lot of times, especially if it's a smaller organization that you're looking to acquire, you may not have the details that you're looking for, or as deep as you want to go. So you just have to go with what you can get, and let your FinOps teams translate that to your finance teams to understand how it fits into the model.
And I think there's this almost kind of like fun paradox of efficiency versus opportunity. And let me kind of explain what I mean. You know, you tend to look for these metrics, kind of like you said, they might be, maybe it's a unit of whatever this product is that they're sold, versus the infrastructure cost, or maybe it's this revenue over hosting cost. And you want those to be in some certain, bands. But let's say they're perfectly efficient, that means there's less opportunity for that cost reduction. And vice versa is true, right? Let's say they have a number that's far outside one of these standard ranges, but there's a ton of opportunity, right? There was a bank that I was working with a few years ago that had, almost $80 million a year on AWS, and they were being targeted for, excuse me, a couple of companies were looking at them to be acquired. And when we actually got into their cloud spend, we realized they were using spreadsheets to manage everything, and they had about $15 million of savings they were able to unlock, right? So there's this kind of fun paradox. So from your perspective, like, what do you kind of think of this aspect of, like, you can come in here and save a ton of potential money, even though it might fall out of a certain standard range, but that means there's more value after the acquisition. Like if I'm a PE firm, I can come in, I can make a couple quick changes. All of a sudden, this company is more valuable. Do I want to look for a company that has all of this opportunity? Or do I want to look for a company that is efficient and has all of these unit metrics that are kind of falling within these standard ranges?
It's a great paradox. It, I think either one is opportunity. It just depends on how much you're willing to put towards that optimization. If you're looking for just something that can run as is,
Hmm.
under new ownership and folded into a portfolio, then you obviously want that optimized, clean cut. Nothing to squeeze out there. If you're looking for something to invest in that needs some work, that you can invest some resourcing in, some tooling in, to understand really what's going on, and then reduce those costs down from a hyperscaler perspective, then that could be a target opportunity there for that investment, knowing that you're going in needing to invest, that it might be heavy on the resources that could be cut down, that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
it really depends on how you want to operate that business, and how much you want to invest in it to optimize it. And also during the diligence phase, in some cases, you can write into like letters of intent and things to do that deeper dive of connecting a FinOps tool, whether it's FinOut or another tool that you already use. Can we pull details into our system to see what those recommendations are? Do the analysis the way our teams are used to operating, versus going off of spreadsheets or whatever else the other team might be using. So there's some opportunities there that can be done during the diligence phase with the FinOps team,
Hmm.
to help with those decisions and get a clearer view.
And I think also that clearer view is so interesting too, because if I'm putting my finance hat on, and let's say I have just some of this top level information, and some of the top level information maybe I have an export from, we'll use Amazon as an example,
Mhm.
but I've got, maybe it's Compute Optimizer, my trusted advisor recommendations. So as a financier, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, hey, here's the total cloud spend, here's the breakdown. But, oh, we have an opportunity to save 10% here. We have, $2 million a year of potential right sizing reductions, where we know from that FinOps lens, when we go in and actually look at this, maybe a fraction of those are things we can actually go out and achieve. But what's your perspective on kind of bringing in FinOps for that lens too, right? We sometimes we almost want to ratchet back some of those expectations so that we're not kind of overselling the potential value here.
It's critical because not only are you using those calculations for forecasting, but also your operations post close. Like, what are we going to do? What is our roadmap? So if you go and look and say, hey, the optimizer shows, $10 million in reductions a year, this is going to be our number one priority. And then that's what you build into your forecast of $10 million in savings. And then once you actually get in there and understand the product a little bit more and find out that less than a quarter of those can actually be executed because of the way the product runs or because of the backend platform. It's running on legacy applications that require, VMs to be up and running full time. It can't handle a shutdown, turn on, right sizing kind of environment. Now suddenly you're $750,000 over budget because you didn't calculate that in initially. So it's critical to understand what can and can't be done. Diligence is usually a very fast process as well, so it's not going to be perfect. It never is. But
Mhm.
FinOps teams can at least add a better lens to it and say, okay, optimizer says 10 million. Let's do a quarter of that for year one and just see where things land, because we know in the industry you can't do 100% of those, and help get that forecast a little bit closer to actual real life than somebody looking from an accounting lens.
Yep. And what I'll say as well, what we tend to see is that one of the fastest ways to get your pink slip as an executive is a failed acquisition, or one where you're overstating those potential synergies, the value creation, you're going way over budget. Make sure you're involving your FinOps
Yeah,
teams. Now,
absolutely.
that'll tee us up into this next question, of course. But summarize this all up for us, Peter. So, how can FinOps involvement add value in this kind of pre-acquisition phase, or especially this due diligence phase?
Sure. It adds a clarity to the financials via the technology, is the way I would put it, right? So understanding what can and can't be done from a numbers perspective with the technology tie-ins, knowing that optimizer isn't 100% accurate or whatever the recommendations is, and then understanding how that cost is actually being used and what commitments are there, what things that you would not be able to exit out of are there from a timeline perspective. Can break all those costs down and partner with the financial side to understand the full scope and timeline to reap the benefits of that acquisition.
Fantastic. Well said. Now, I want to talk through another area, and it's this idea of this hidden risks. So, we're going to look at what are some of the biggest hidden cloud cost risks that surface after a deal closes. This will start kind of transitioning us to that phase two. But, Peter, I'll let you talk through some of these key different areas.
Sure. And we've talked about a little bit of them before, right? That you want to assess in the diligence phase. But if you're not sure or you don't know about the technical debt that's behind the product, cleanup that has not been done, projects that have failed that are still running, engineering environments for a product that isn't live, that aren't needed but are still running, right? So it's listed here as zombie resources and technical debt, but it's all those scenarios that FinOps practitioners are used to looking for and hunting for. Um, you wouldn't know those looking at just a total number. You have to understand the footprint. You have to understand the usage of those environments. So finding those later on, great, we can shut those down, but we need to be aware of them. Contractual landmines is a big one. Touched on it
Hmm.
a few times, right? Egress fees. Okay, we're going to port this product out of this environment, put it in our environment or under our hyperscaler. Well, you're going to have to pay to get it there and pay to get it in there. So, what do those ingress and egress fees look like? Going between regions, going between providers. Do you have any third-party solutions that can help with that? Now that FinOps is expanded beyond hyperscalers and really looking at the SaaS picture, your FinOps team might be aware of what it costs per terabyte to migrate through a third-party network provider. You can include those into your forecast, but also be able to track those and monitor those as you go. Because just because you buy the company doesn't mean your first forecast is your last forecast, right? You're constantly
Hmm.
reviewing it, constantly adjusting it, and your FinOps teams can play a critical role in monitoring those costs. And then they can be recorded as part of that M&A versus part of your core costs for accounting practices and things like that. Commitment traps, right? Lock-ins, things that you committed to. If you're not a provider or you're not a enterprise account with AWS or Azure or Oracle or whichever hyperscaler of choice, and you want to move them, what are you locked into? What can you not get out of? It's not just a lift and shift. You're stuck paying those commitments until the end of those terms. So really just understanding what those restrictions are and what you can do, the timelines. You can't just walk in one day and lift and shift it to another provider. So it's going to take you time. Does that line up with your timelines? Or do your FinOps teams need to be aware that, hey, our roadmap is 5 years. Right now, there's a 1-year commitment. We can actually make additional commitments to continue saving our costs to that 5-year mark, that roadmap, on that roadmap. So there's ways of understanding that both from a perspective and knowing that it's there, but also from a future perspective and kind of combining those two there.
Yeah, well said. And I don't think I've heard folks talk as much about even something like the ingress egress fees. So we're not getting into the weeds too much, but I just want to call that out. I think fantastic just area that FinOps can help out with.
It's always a gotcha.
Let's talk about phase 2, the idea of first 100 days of integration. So let's talk through this. We've got a couple lenses we'll talk through. What does just even something like visibility look like when we're integrating two completely separate tech stacks?
Sure. So from a FinOps lens, right, you want your reporting to be the same. You don't want your reporting for one tech stack to look differently than the other and have different metrics and different ways of even being formatted. So this is where tooling is critical that can support multi-cloud. You connect your FinOps tooling, you connect to whatever it is that's running, and then you get your reporting so you can do side by side. Your technical teams, your executive teams are familiar with looking at certain types of reports and certain metrics. You want to try to mirror that. So visibility into cost from a FinOps focus is critical when you're integrating. Also looking at the solutions being used. So are we a shop that's using a lot of native services? Can we move some of the functionality to native services as part of the roadmap for future cost savings and flexibility, right? So it ties very closely to the engineering roadmaps. But so you work with your engineering leadership, you work with your FinOps leadership and your finance leadership to all come to a consensus on this is what it looks like, here's how much it costs, and this is what the roadmap looks like.
Fantastic. And a couple other things we'll call out, really thinking about when we're integrating this, right? You're not going to rip out a tech stack in 100 days. Right. So it's focus on this kind of roadmap planning and what that future looks like. A couple other things we'll call out worth looking for, and we don't mean this necessarily from an overall pure like SaaS licensing perspective, but you might find that the different companies also have various tools for even managing cloud costs. And you might be able to start identifying redundant tools and kind of plan for some contract expirations for some additional value that you might not have factored in at the start. And then we'll talk more about this as we go forward, but just the complexity of merging different hyperscalers, right? So oftentimes what we see is so many companies are multi-cloud because of acquisitions and how they plan on getting that immediate visibility, like you mentioned, which they have to get. It is so crucial to get that to start realizing value immediately, but then planning for that future, even when you might have completely different infrastructure or have to migrate everything together. So let's talk about a couple other ideas here. And this is something I'm personally curious to get your take on, but it's this idea of how do you actually reconcile two companies with completely different cloud cost cultures? And I'll just tee this up a little bit too. So as we think about kind of this post acquisition phase, we are trying to get value. We want to achieve synergies, but even something as simple as cost reporting might be radically different from one company versus another. You might have completely different FinOps models. One might have a FinOps team, one might have a single person, one might have it kind of half done by an engineering team. So how do you start reconciling just even these cultures?
Sure, yeah, and this comes down to leadership, right? So leadership needs to bring the stakeholders into the same room, same meeting, and talk through how do we want to do this in the future now that we're one. What works, what doesn't work, where are the pain points, and what does our roadmap look like going forward, both from a FinOps team perspective, are there two teams that can combine and work together to start aligning on reporting, Is it decentralized in one company and centralized in the other? Okay, can we look at how does that team dynamic work? Do we still want a centralized team and then maybe add some more dynamic and decentralized resources across our existing org to mirror? Does that work well? And also know that things aren't set in stone, right? You can try something and see if it integrates from a reporting perspective and then change it if it doesn't, as long as everybody's on the same page, understands what you're trying to do and the mission of coming up with a cohesive single pane of glass, single way of working, regardless of what your hyperscalers are, regardless of what your vendors are, your SaaS companies are. Come to the table, work together to come up with a solution, and don't just try to mandate that across, because what works for one company and one org may not work for another. And even though you're under the same umbrella, you still need to find what the best parts of each are to combine them into one.
Yeah, and what I want to call out here too is, it can sometimes be really simple to think, well, okay, we have, our target and our buyer company. Now that we have now merged, we're just going to get great visibility into this infrastructure cost. Are we on track with what we planned at the start? It can be really difficult, right? You might find that, one of the companies is a software company that has this incredibly complex architecture that it's all microservices, shared infrastructure. You can't even properly tag it, let alone its own challenges with how do you allocate costs to something like a cost center that maybe someone in finance wants to use to actually track how you're doing here. And the other company might have really simple architecture. It might just be one single AWS account is one cost center. Map this out. You've got perfect visibility. So actually reconciling those two things, with or without, FinOps software, can be incredibly difficult and complicated. So another call out here of why you want FinOps involved in this process. It is going to get you that visibility much quicker, especially during those first 100 days. It's going to simplify what could be incredibly different and difficult cost cultures. And it's going to make sure that as you're doing some of that future planning, which we're going to tee up next, you have all of that information that you need.
Yeah, and it's also based on what the intention is with that acquisition, right? Are you going to run it as a standalone business, not necessarily incorporate it and leave it, running its own show, just under different leadership? You may not need to go through the efforts of trying to combine and trying to keep everything the same. It's less impactful and it's less work to say, okay, we're going to keep you completely independent, keep your reporting, keep doing what you're doing. You just simply have a different, parent, that type of thing. So you also have to look at what the vision is and what the intent is, because you don't want to spend a bunch of time and resources trying to change something that doesn't need to be changed.
Yeah, that's a good call out. And that'll bring us to this phase 3. So thinking about at this point, really kind of what you just said, Peter. You have to think about what the future goals for this acquisition are. And then if you need to do some sort of combination, how you reconcile cultures, you unify visibility. But let's talk about this, maybe from more general standpoint first, and then we can always get into some more details. But what role does FinOps play in deciding the fate of acquired workloads?
Yeah, this isn't just FinOps, right? This is revenue ops. This is all of the future of the business. Like, why did that acquisition happen? But if the acquisition was to expand the portfolio, keep that product, but you want to, let's say, move it to your preferred cloud of choice, then FinOps becomes a key player in that, in estimating what that cost is going to be, not just what to move it, but actually what it is to run it there. By the time you're making these decisions, right, your engineering teams, your architecture teams have had a chance to understand really what this business is, what the product is, how it works. And then how are we going to move this over to our vendor of choice? FinOps is right there alongside to do those cost projections with each of the architecture designs, understand what the estimates are, and then also what is the cost to get it there? What is, if we're lifting and shifting it over, or we're just moving the data over, right? So FinOps plays a key role in the future road mapping, future forecasting, and as that becomes part of just the normal portfolio and no longer an M&A, it's all the books get combined on the back end with accounting, and now it's part of the normal reporting. And FinOps now needs to not only focus on reporting on more information and more of what's going on, but also, is there another M&A coming where we got to do the same process again? So having this playbook going through it,
Mhm.
understanding it is key to growth via acquisition.
Sure. Just a couple other points here. If it does make sense to do any sort of migration, if it does make sense to have that alignment, and we're not talking about something run standalone, making sure you've got the right unit economics in place to make some of those decisions, and you have all the data in mind, because it really can be a very complicated decision. And I
Absolutely.
think this is interesting too, but it's just the sometimes the either the cost of doing nothing, or you might even find that the data justifies doing nothing, or actually running something like a standalone business, because it might have completely different architecture. So making sure that FinOps is involved with being able to come up with those decisions, and then finally having that help combine this kind of uniform reporting structure that you mentioned. Because what we really want to make sure here, as everything is kind of being commingled, as it's become part of that new kind of operational company, and as they might look to new acquisitions in the future, making sure that you have this full financial accountability with really, really great and granular data, so that you've established that full value of the acquisition. You can report on those metrics.
Absolutely.
Couple other key points here, and we'll start to get into our wrap up. But as we're thinking about a number of these points, right, we want to make sure that FinOps is involved to identify platforms, maybe to even sunset, right? So there's a lot we talked about maybe combining. There's some we'll talk about standalone. There might be various things we actually might want to just go ahead and remove. We might find that after we look at the data, the target company that's been acquired, maybe they have a variety of products that actually aren't achieving enough revenue. We see all of these exercises sometimes play out, especially with things like PE. Say, okay, well, these two products that you have right now, they're not meeting some of those KPIs. So those are out, everything else that can stay. We also might look at this from a workload fate. So if we want to re-architect, if we want to stay put, if we want to combine, we'll consider that in some of these decisions as well. And then finally, and I'll kind of call this out, and Peter, I'd love for you to put a nice cherry on top of this, but we've talked a lot about this kind of commitment alignment. And this might be a number of different commitments. It might be combining different workloads so that you can have a larger EDP or Mac program to get a bigger discount. It might be taking a look at existing commitments, your RI savings plans, figure out what's not being used, and maybe even the some of the company as well can use some of that what's not being used if you bring that over from another company. But we talked about some of the hidden risks here. Let's talk about some of the potential opportunities that we can look out from the FinOps lens.
Yeah, so some of the opportunities definitely include you're now increasing your scale, you're increasing your spend. So now you have more leverage with your providers, or being able to branch into a provider that you're not with today because you didn't have a large footprint before. So maybe you're running a few small things in GCP and you had most of your stuff in AWS, and you end up buying an organization that is a GCP shop, and they have established relationships, they have executive agreements already. Now you can leverage those volumes of scale to support your other product and your other business, merge that into your that EA that you acquired, and save going that route, and negotiate better discounts in the future. So there's a lot of alignment. There's a lot of complexity to it. If anybody in the FinOps world goes and looks at commitments and CUDs and what have you, it's a lengthy list usually, especially in large organizations. So it's a lot of analysis, but you can map out what the strategy is for the organization based on what's there, both at acquisition as well as in the future, and how it plays into the plans. Like you mentioned, using it for other parts of the business. Is there a you know a dev group that wants to dabble in this area, and you have some commitments that are available? Let them use that at a discounted rate. Gives them the visibility they need, and you're also not wasting that empty cloud commitment.
Yeah, good call outs. So as we kind of think of wrapping up, and we'll go into our Q&A after this, but let's think about what we're really talking about in this webinar. So step one, right, make sure that you are bringing FinOps in earlier to due diligence. If you are in a FinOps role on this webinar, make sure you are advocating to help out in this area. It is great for the career, and you add a ton of value. And what you get, of course, this increased accuracy during due diligence, and what I'll call this added synergy potential as well. You have fantastic insights into one of the largest expenses and sources of growth for the company. So you are there to help unlock that value. Make sure you're using FinOps to plan for visibility across both organizations. That post acquisition, sometimes it can be incredibly difficult to actually start reconciling. Okay, what are we paying for? What are we getting out of this? How is this going to plan? How do we track? How do we forecast this when both companies have completely different reporting and cost structures? Make sure FinOps is involved. And what you're going to get out of that is significantly faster synergy capture in those first 100 days, additional opportunities for cost reductions, and you start getting into that planning phase. So definitely make sure you're working with FinOps to plan migrations, to update some of those contracts and look forward at commitments. Why? So you can have these clear, defensible decisions, whether or not you need to migrate, whether you need to consolidate. And so you can start getting some of those opportunities and value out of those consolidations for things like commitments. Peter, final points here before we go to Q&A?
No, I think that was a great summary, right? To both the FinOps wanting to be involved and asking to be involved in a huge value add, but also to the leaders that are leading these M&As to reach out to your FinOps team and bring them into the fold, bring them under the hood, so to speak, as part of this process to understand more of what you're looking at, what you are potentially signing up for, and your opportunities. So it's a win-win on both sides.
Well said. We have a few minutes left. Let's do some Q&A moderated by Tristan, and then I think we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Alrighty. So just want to say, anyone have any questions, throw it in the chat or the questions box. We do have a couple questions that have already came in, but if you guys have any more, feel free to throw them in there. So I'll start off with one. So you mentioned the valuation multiplier. Could you talk us through how saving $1 million in cloud costs actually turns into $20 million in extra value during a deal? I guess that's for you, Zach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
So the 1 to 20 is just one example of how valuation multipliers work. But if you're thinking of the perspective of a buyer company, one of the very first things you look for after you figure out if you want to go after this target, you look for these potential opportunities, right? And so if you can go ahead and save, maybe it's through economies of scale, maybe it's through some of the discounts that you yourself have in things like your EDPs. But if you can go ahead and reduce this cost for one of those companies, you are increasing the value significantly. So it could be upwards as much as something like the valuation multiplier that you see for that company. So when you get the value out of the M&A deal, what you really want to find are these opportunities where you can quickly reduce the cost, increase the top line revenue, and suddenly, even though you might not have made any major changes at all, financially, that company now looks like it is worth significantly more.
Okay, awesome. No, thank you for that. That makes a ton of sense. I have a couple more questions for you here, actually, that are popping in as we're going. So beyond the obvious numbers, what are some examples of those hidden landmines like egress fees or lock-ins that usually fly under the radar during a standard audit?
Yeah, Peter, let's go to you for that.
Yeah, that's somewhat of a tricky question. We've hinted at a bunch of them throughout the conversation, right? So your commitments are the big ones, regardless of what they're called, CUDs, commitments, savings plans, etc. Your ingress, egress, and a lot of times your idle resources are another one that fly under the radar, right? And they may be tied to commitments. So you may have a commitment for resources and you have a bunch of idle resources out there because let's say they may not have a FinOps team that's monitoring that when you're looking at the company you want to acquire. So looking at all of those values that you would as a normal FinOps practitioner are actually valuable, not just what you're locked into, but what is being used in the environment, what is not being used. If they haven't had a FinOps practice and nobody's really been looking at it, you may walk in and find considerable amount of low-hanging fruit, things that are normal day-to-day in your organization, but are foreign to this other organization because they don't have that formality. So it really could be any of the assets used, any of the configurations used, that kind of thing that could be considered things that you don't necessarily look at every single time.
Yeah, and one thing I'll even call out there too, it might even be something as I'll say simple, but really as complex as financial reporting. right? So,
Sure.
when we're talking about forecasting some of those cloud costs or what you're baking in, are we looking at a cash-based cost? Is it an accrual-based cost? Does it include things like marketplace purchases? Is the buyer versus the target, are they looking at apples to orange metrics, which we tend to see really frequently, and it's just really easy to do that. So it's making sure that you have the right folks in place, especially if you bring forward the FinOps team. You can make sure that that financial reporting layer in and of itself during due diligence is comparing apples to apples. Just because we find so often when we work with companies, and you even ask a question like, how much are you spending on cloud infrastructure? That it's a different answer depending upon the role that you're speaking with. So definitely
Right.
keep that in mind.
Right. And those may be found post close as well, right? So some of this stuff takes time to understand. It takes time to materialize. So you may not get this during the diligence phase, but it's something to look forward for as you start to integrate those companies and functions.
Alrighty, thank you. And I love that you guys got tag team that question. That's what FinOps is all about, creating the culture and working together. So I love that. So do you have another question that came in? Probably will be our last one. We're running low on time here. But from your experience, what's the typical low, no risk cost out opportunity on a percent of spend basis? And this is from TJ. So what he's saying, he's talking stuff that doesn't require architecture or code change, like idle resources, RIs or SPs, commitments, etc.
Yeah, Peter, do you want to start with that, and I'll add in some context?
Sure. I think the ask is, what do you do about those resources that are low risk to take care of? And as an acquirer, if you're the acquiring business, right, you never want to walk in and say, oh, you don't need any of this, and go delete it, right? You don't know what it might be used for. You don't know why it's there. You need to understand the function of that resource before you go and think you can delete it. Some legacy products out there, right, they may run once a month, once a quarter. But the way the product is built, you don't want to necessarily remove that because it'll break the product when it does try to run. I see the clarification there in the chat. How much can you typically save? It is a wide open answer. It depends on the size of the environment. It depends on if they have an established FinOps team that has been doing the work to clean that stuff up ongoing, or if they're not there. It it could be anything. There is not really a number there because every company has a different maturity levels from a FinOps perspective, and every company has a different configuration, a different size deployment, and it's impossible to put a number to it. Zach, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, what I'll do, TJ, I'll use a quote from Gartner from a few years ago. It's a little bit more general at the start, but I think you'll kind of see how it answers your question. But it's that for companies that have not had any sort of FinOps tooling in the past, they typically see usually an average of a 30% cost reduction year one and about a 15% cost reduction each year after that ongoing. Now, I don't mean to use those as hard and fast numbers, but what I like to call out is that having a FinOps function, having FinOps tooling provides that ongoing efficiency, because as the clouds mature, you have this role that always keeps on top of them. You're always looking to update your architecture. You're always looking for new synergies. And when you have all the complexities that you have in something like an M&A, all of a sudden you have more economies of scale that are potentially open, where you might be able to co-term contracts and get a larger discount for something like an EDP. You might have more unused savings plans and RIs that can suddenly be used. You might be able to purchase more of those and combine those as well to get some of these additional discounts. So even if we're not changing any architecture, but you have that pure FinOps function, that value is going to be significant. So we can't give you an answer that says you will absolutely save 4 to 6% every time, right? We can't give you that answer. You'll see that this adds significant value, and there will always be those opportunities. The important thing is you need the FinOps role to be able to evaluate them, because if you don't, you're just purely that finance evaluation, you might think anywhere from 2 to 30% could be savings. That's way too much variance to try to ever project forward.
Great way of summarizing it.
Okay, it looks like Adam is typing. We may have another question, but TJ also just responded in the chat. I'm not sure if you guys saw that, Zach and Peter.
Good. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I have another question that just came in. How do you handle the tagging nightmare when you're trying to merge two teams that have completely different ways of managing and talking about cloud costs?
If there was a simple answer to that one, I would love to know what it is. Tagging is always a challenge. It's even more of a challenge when you double what you're trying to tag. Really, you need to take a look at what your future roadmap looks like, right? Again, are these products going to stay separate? Are they going to be in their own silos? Are they going to be run independently? And if so, they can continue to run with their existing tagging if they exist. But if they are something you're going to be merging together, you need to look at what that future architecture looks like, how you're going to be putting that together, and then determine a new tagging from that kind of that point forward. It is very hard to go back and retag things, especially in an enterprise environment. You've got different SDLCs. You have different ways of deploying things. So it's a concentrated effort. It's a large human effort to do and change. So you really want to look at how does this overlay with our architecture changes going forward, if it's needed. If you can maintain and it's going to be completely separate, your reporting is going to be completely separate, you're going to operate this as a completely separate business, you may not want to try to put that amount of work to your engineering team.
And I'll also say software helps. So please see me after.
Sure. Yeah. Virtual tagging is a huge help if you want to, but actually tagging the assets and retagging them and what have you, you don't want to do that multiple times. You want to look at your future, work with your engineering teams, work with your DevOps teams, and understand what that future architecture looks like and what makes sense for the new vision of the product versus what you have existing.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So I believe that's we're at time for today. So Zach, Peter, thank you guys for hosting this webinar today. Really appreciate it. And then also I just threw my email and LinkedIn in the chat. If anyone has any questions that come up post webinar, don't be afraid to reach out and we'll make sure to get back to you with answers ASAP. Alrighty. Well, thanks so much and have a great day, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.